Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we're going to start this time out, as we like to do when we can. On occasion, we have some good news, a couple of bits of good news for you. First up, on September 3rd, a group of LGBTQ plus students at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah, and along with some allies, gathered in a city park for what was billed as a back-to-school pride night. They were verbally assaulted by a group of bigots who yelled hateful slurs at them, calling them pedophiles and groomers and holding up, signs with quotes from the Book of Mormon. This cretinous crowd appeared to be particularly incensed by the latest obsession of the knuckle draggers because there was a drag show. In this case, featuring current and former BYU students as performers. Okay, so what's the good news in this? The good news is that a dozen people shielded the gathering by dressing up as angels with costumes made from white sheets draped over PVC pipe and stood between the screechers and the celebrants. These imitation angels, made up of both BYU students and townspeople, said their intent was not only to screen the LGBTQ plus people from their detractors and the fanatics, but to push back against the university's policy with regard to same-sex relationships, under which any display, even just holding hands, is cause for disciplinary action. And by the way, as a footnote to all this, I know, good on those angels, by the way, before I forget to say that, as a footnote to all this, the reason BYU is able to get away with banning same-sex relationships is because despite Title IX, which bans discrimination based on sex or gender identification, they can get away with this because its religious affiliation grants it a series of exemptions under the law. Because in other words, if you can say, God told me to, then, it's a get-out-of-jail-free card for bigots. All right, the other good news, we've actually had two recent wins in federal court, which is worth noting because they're becoming increasingly rare thanks to a decades-long campaign by the far right to pack the courts, along with the Democrats' wimpy response as he kind of just sat and watched it happen. First, on August 18th, U.S. District Judge Mark Walker issued a preliminary injunction against Florida's so-called Stop Woke Act. That bill attempts to block discussion of racism and white privilege in schools and in private workplaces. And no, you do not misunderstand. The law says it is illegal for private employers to present cultural sensitivity or racial awareness training to employees. Now, it was those latter provisions that the judge blocked, saying this violates free speech and is unconstitutionally vague. In fact, he wrote that, I'm quoting him here, Florida has seemed like a First Amendment upside down. That is, it's a place, he said, where instead of the First Amendment barring the state but allowing private actors to burden speech, this law proposes that private actors cannot burden speech, but the state can. This and other suits against this law are continuing, including over the impact on education. Diane Roberts, a journalist and professor of English at Florida State University, recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post that I'm quoting here, a lot of people will self-censor, and I think that was the idea all along. DeSantis aims to scare academics. Unfortunately, it's working. Okay, and the other court victory recent, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled on September 6th that actually upheld a lower court ruling that the state of Washington was correct and acted properly in 2018 in banning so-called conversion therapy for minors. This being a bogus practice that claims to be able to change the sexual orientation or gender identification of its clients, patients. 21 states and more than 100 cities and towns have banned this false therapy, and those bans have been upheld in other courts. And one of the, they call themselves therapists in Washington, challenged that state's law, claiming the ban, here's a shock, violated his freedom of speech and his freedom of religion. The Ninth Circuit saw through that, saying that this law relates to professional conduct, not to speech. Now, medical professionals have long rejected conversion therapy. They've done it for decades, saying the practice violates the Hippocratic Oath and actually carries clinical risks to those who undergo it. Indeed, one 2018 study found that more than 60% of children attempted suicide after a therapist attempted to change their sexual orientation. Any ban on these laws is one to the good. And by the way, it also occurs to me that the same socio-political class of people who want to be free to forcibly convert or cure LGBTQ people also want to make it a crime for parents to offer gender-affirming care to those same youth. All right, next up, an episode of our regular feature, 2 weeks of stupid, clowns and outrages. And we start, as we usually do, with the clowns. And the first clown, well, it does not involve, it relates to, but he is not the clown here, it relates to a man named George Dawson. He was the grandson of slaves. He was born in Texas in 1898, and he learned to read in 1996. Now, you heard right, he was 98 at the time. 2 years later, he co-wrote an autobiography called Life is So Good. This book served as such an inspiration to certain people that the Carroll County, Texas Independent School District named a middle school after him. Late in August, it developed that the George Dawson Middle School has pulled George Dawson's book from school shelves, pending a review for age and content appropriateness for students, to be precise, for 7th graders. It's apparently because one chapter in this book referred to lynching and rape, which concepts, of course, which 7th graders have never heard of before, and so can only be discussed through a heavy veil of teacher supervision. Now, the school denies the book is actually banned, but as one commentator put it, says, okay, it's not a ban, but it's clearly a censoring, and is there really difference? I don't know if there is. Well, personally, I don't know if there is either, actually, here. But I do know one thing. The Carroll County, Texas Independent School District is run by a bunch of clowns who should change the name of that school because they are unworthy of it. All right, our next clown is U.S. Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana, who was all in a lather about an animated horror sitcom on FX called Little Demon, which is based on the wholly realistic scenario of a woman and her 13-year-old daughter trying to live a normal life despite the fact that the girl's father is Satan and he wants her soul. Johnson said, I couldn't get the remote fast enough to shield my 11-year-old from a preview of the show that ran during LSU's football opener against Florida State. He wondered how many will tune into this new series, owned and marketed by Disney, and the word Disney was in all caps in this, because, of course, the company, having committed the crime of being reasonably kind to its LGBTQ employees, now serves on the right wing as something just one step short of, old Nick himself. Danny DeVito, by the way, does the voice of Satan on the series, which Johnson calls clearly evil. The daughter is voiced by DeVito's own daughter, Lucy. Now, Johnson defends himself against criticism by crying free speech. And in this case, I have to admit, I agree with him. He was free to say what he said. He was even free to call for a boycott of the series. He didn't really do that, but he'd be free to do it if he did, because he's not using the power of his office to try to impose some kind of penalty on Disney or FX. However, I can also say that Mike Johnson is a right-wing wacko and a clown. And I wonder what he thought about the Munsters. All right, turning now to the outrages. This one strikes me as an outrage just because it's just so cheap, just so shabby. Now, first off, you need to know the background here. After a long campaign, the federal government has finally decided to offer some students some relief from what's been for many a crushing financial burden of student debt. And by the way, I would say to those who don't get the value of or the need for such relief that you really need to do some homework, you really do some background on how much more higher education costs now than it did when you went to school, along with how much more necessary taking on the debt to do that is necessary to success than it was when you went to school, plus the fact that you have to consider that the value of a college education does not get as much of return on investment as it did when you went to school. Anyway, relief of up to $10,000 has been offered to some students who meet certain income and debt criteria, and $20,000 to students who took out Pell Grants, which are designed for lower income earners. By the way, and here a bonus point to Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bob Menendez for thinking ahead. Forgiven debt is usually regarded by the IRS as imputed income, treating the amount forgiven as if you were given that amount in cash in a lump sum. Now, I can understand why this provision exists at all, because it's easy to imagine a multitude of ways to completely dodge taxes without it. But I've always felt that the income should be imputed over the time over which the loan was to be repaid, not all at once. But anyway, Warren and Menendez didn't want debt forgiveness to turn into a multi-$1,000 tax bill, so they got a provision included in the American Rescue Plan saying that from 2021 to 2025, forgiven student loans would not be included as part of gross income. Okay, cool. What's the outrage? It's that Mississippi has announced that the state is not going to exempt student debt from state taxes, and 13 other states, most of them, surprise, surprise, red states, may well do the same. As Farron Cousins of the Ring of Fire noted, he's quoting him here, "If you were a corporation, we'd waive these taxes because that's what we do here in red states. We don't want the corporations or the wealthy to have to pay taxes. But you're a poor person who just found out that you might have to struggle as much, so you're going to have to pay up." Meanwhile, the right wing wildly waves its victimhood banner, whining that somebody else got a benefit that they didn't, got relief that they didn't because they didn't need it. Leave it to some folks to turn a good thing into an outrage. All right, next up, we have two RIPs this week. The first one is Mikhail Gorbachev, the former leader and reformer of what was then the Soviet Union. He died on August 30th after a long illness. He was 91. To some, perhaps many people, Gorbachev almost seems like a footnote to history now, dying in political obscurity. But though little regarded now, he may have had a greater impact on the second half of the 20th century, than perhaps any other political figure. As it was put by Michael McFaul, a political analyst and former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, it's hard to think of a single person who altered the course of history more in a positive direction than Gorbachev did. He was, McFaul said, an idealist who believed in the power of ideas and individuals. Now, in his memoirs, Gorbachev said he had long been frustrated that in the Soviet Union, a country with immense natural resources, tens of millions of people lived in poverty. He determined that his government had become so bureaucratically rigid and sterile that it could not establish the national standard of living of which the nation was capable. Well, after becoming General Secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985, in practical fact, the leader of the country, Gorbachev worked to free up that system using the principle of glasnost, usually translated as openness, in order to achieve perestroika, or restructuring. He freed political prisoners. He allowed open debate and multi-candidate elections. He gave his countrymen freedom to travel abroad. He halted religious oppression, reduced the nuclear arsenals, and established closer ties with the West. But amid all the hope, he forgot a truth that leading a movement can wind up generating a tide that can sweep you to places you never intended to go. Glasnost not only opened up political and cultural debate, it also allowed for the reemergence of old, long repressed ethnic and nationalistic conflicts and resentments, as well as the emergence of a capitalist upper class whose grasping hands, no surprise, brought the Soviet economy crashing down even as their personal wealth soared. Ultimately, those conflicts and the economic impact shattered the Soviet Union, something that Gorbachev did not want. As many have noted, he wanted to reform the USSR, not dismantle it. But history would not be denied, and communist regimes in the Eastern European satellite states either fell or broke away one after another. To his credit now, Gorbachev never considered using force to keep the Soviet Union together, fearing it would generate chaos and civil war in a nation brimming with nuclear weapons. But that refusal also undermined his political support because he came to be seen as passively allowing, even overseeing, the collapse of a once great nation into shredded remnants. A coup against him in August 1991 failed, but left him so politically weak that he wound up resigning in December of that year, a day before the Soviet Union wrote itself into oblivion. He remained politically active, although without a base of support, he could do little more than issue statements, which he did, including one in April opposing the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Personally, ultimately, I am sure that history will be kinder to Mikhail Gorbachev than current awareness is. So, R.I.P. Mikhail Gorbachev. And our other R.I.P. goes to author and activist Barbara Ehrenreich, who died of a stroke on September 1st, a few days after her 81st birthday. She was the author of 21 books and numerous essays, and was accurately described by Democracy Now!'s co-host Juan Gonzalez as really one of the towering figures of the radical and progressive movement in America. Her best-known work out of her many and varied books and essays was the landmark Nickel and Dimed on Not Getting By in America. It was published in 2001. As she put it, I took a challenge that I set on myself, which was to see whether or not I could support myself on the money I could earn on entry-level jobs, that is, the so-called unskilled labor jobs, the kind that usually pay minimum wage. The short answer? She found that despite being a single person with no family to support and keeping spending to a bare minimum, it was impossible, even as that spending included nothing for things like healthcare coverage. Not only that, she realized, but because you're employed and getting minimum wage, you're not considered to be poor. You don't appear in the poverty statistics for the country. Her conclusion, the obvious and enforced by reality one, was that, quoting her, jobs that don't pay enough to live on do not cure poverty. They condemn you, in fact, to a life of low-wage labor and extreme insecurity. And that is still true all these years later. It's been said of her passing, she was never much for thoughts and prayers, as said by her son Ben, but you can honor her memory by loving one another and by fighting like hell. I hope I can find the strength and courage to fulfill that request. R.I.P. Barbara Ehrenreich. And let's take a break. And we are back. And we're going to end up the show with this. We are now 6 months into the war in Ukraine. And despite the cheerleading and the latest rather breathless reports of gains in Ukraine's new counteroffensive, accompanied by the latest round of predictions that the Russian army is again on the verge of collapse, the war actually looks like what I suppose you might call a dynamic stalemate, with villages and crossroads being gained and lost and regained, only to have other villages and crossroads in another part of the country be gained and being lost and regained and lost again, with the overall status in the country not changing all that much. It seems as Donovan sang about Indochina, and the war drags on. What doesn't change is the carnage. It only grows. There have been nearly 6,000 confirmed, note that word, confirmed civilian deaths in Ukraine in this time. At least 8,000 civilians have been wounded. Note confirmed because it's estimated the actual total of civilian death in Ukraine is in the tens of thousands. There have been more than 6.5 million refugees. About 9,000, it's estimated, Ukrainian troops have been killed, along with about 25,000 Russian soldiers. And Ukraine now faces a reconstruction bill that currently totals at least $114 billion, plus the impact of environmental damage that is great enough that a leader of a Ukrainian environmental group wondered out loud if it was even possible to rebuild. And the war drags on. And apparently the military thinkers in high places expect it to continue its grinding way as the tens of billions of dollars in weaponry coming to Ukraine from NATO. And make no mistake about this. This is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a war between Russia and NATO. Because I don't see how anyone can deny that were it not for those tens of billions of dollars, or not for all that weaponry, all that ammunition coming out of NATO, if it were not for that, Ukraine would have been reduced to little more than harassing guerrilla attacks some months ago. Anyway, the point now is that the latest rounds of weaponry going to Ukraine represent a shift to a longer-term strategy to supply Ukraine's, quote, medium to long-term military needs, which means that these great military thinkers in high places expect this war to go on for a period of time to be measured in at least months. And what's worse is that neither side, having crossed whatever red line they did, but now having crossed those lines, whatever lines they crossed, neither side shows any interest in stepping back the other way. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky marked the nation's Independence Day on August 24th with a speech declaring, "What is the end of the war for us? We used to say peace, now we say victory." And then added, "To us, Ukraine means the whole of Ukraine, all 25 regions, without any concessions or compromises. Donbass is Ukraine, and we will get it back. Crimea is Ukraine, and we will get it back." Note, by the way, that actually acknowledges effectively that Ukraine controls neither Donbass nor Crimea, and in fact hasn't for like 8 years. But for his part, on September 7th, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow will press on with its military campaign until it reaches its goals, which he again claimed involved protecting civilians in the Donbass region, insisting that we did not start the fighting, we're trying to stop it. Now, pro-Russian separatists in that region have been fighting with the central government in Ukraine since 2014, and that insurrection would have provided the excuse for the invasion. So on the one hand, we've got forget peace, we want total victory, and on the other hand, we're killing people in order to save them. And the war drags on, and appears it will for some time. And there's another aspect of this. Another aspect that I have to address. It's something that I find just deeply morally offensive. Now, I say at the outset that I'm not going to name any names or cite any sites because the individuals are not the point. The overall attitude is. It shames me to say that there are segments of the progressive, or at least ostensibly progressive left, for who this war has become less of a tragedy or a good cause, and has become rather more of a touchstone, because for them, this is actually not about Russia or Ukraine or NATO. It's about Tweety Pie. It's about Donald Trump. Now, after failing, despite their best efforts, to blame Tweety Pie's 2016 election victory on Jill Stein, and oh my, how they did try, the focus turned to Russia and its collusion with the Gopper campaign. Now, the idea that Tweety Pie's victory could have had something to do with Clinton or her campaign, that idea being unacceptable, it had then to be Russia's fault. Because and it was clear that Russia did meddle in the campaign. Unfortunately, there's actually little evidence that it actually made a difference one way or the other, but no matter, it didn't matter. They colluded, they aided Tweety Pie, and he won. Therefore, it's their fault, and Tweety Pie became a traitor and Putin's puppet, while Moscow became the focus of all evil, the same it was in the 50s and the 60s. Put another way, For these people, they became openly eager to see a new Cold War because being anti-Russian was a way to emphasize how anti-Trump they are. When Russia invaded Ukraine, as soon as its initial offense stalled, talk of survival and defense turned to talk of victory. And every Russian failure, every Russian loss became an occasion for whooping and hollering. For these people, it became war porn. We had people writing essays about how we are honored and privileged to be part of supporting the war, even as that support consisted of sitting in your den writing essays about the nobility of endorsing other people sending weapons to other people to be used to kill still other people. The first time that a certain missile, a NATO-supplied missile, was used in Ukraine, one writer referred to this not as the latest weapon in the battlefield or something that might provide a military edge to Ukraine or whatever. They described it as, and this is a quote, an exciting debut, as if they were describing the opening day of the latest summer blockbuster movie. Meanwhile, those who question the wisdom of the war, who ask, especially now amid the leveled cities, they ask, what's to be gained that is worth the inevitable price that gain would take? Those people are labeled tankies, a slur originally directed against those who continued to support the Soviet Union after its invasion of Hungary in 1956. In other words, question this war and you're a communist stooge. And just the other day, there's an item that was actually titled, Today's Russian Stuff Blowing Up Roundup. And the first sentence of it, lots of Russian stuff in Ukraine has been going kaboom in all caps lately. And then it said, here's a collaborator meeting his end from 2 weeks ago. It was a video. There was apparently a Ukrainian collaborator, and his car was blown up. His car was blown up with him in it. And there's a video of the car exploding. And, they had this video that showed the explosion from a couple of different perspectives, showed it going off, the flash, showed people running away and from the blast and big column of black smoke and flame and all the rest of this. And this was presented with a Nirvana soundtrack. They put a musical soundtrack to this. That same item that cited that referred to the results of a Ukrainian artillery attack on a bridge near Kherson and gave a link to the video, but said there that you should be forewarned about that video because it contained human remains. Because we have to be protected against that. We have to be careful about that. That we want to avoid. Avoid seeing the dead bodies, the burnt flesh, the shredded limbs, the pools of blood. Avoid seeing the flies swarming around the decaying entrails. Avoid hearing, as Mark Twain wrote in the War Prayer, the shrieks of the wounded writhing in pain. Be forewarned about seeing any of that. Because it's better that we go back to whooping and hollering about kaboom. And every whoop, every holler, beneath it all, a thumb in the eye to Donald Tweety Pie Trump. I'm ashamed. That's it. I'm out of here. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Peace.